हॅलो हॅलो युट्यूबला आहे ना म्यूट करू
Just
Camera on कर दे.
एक मिनट on करो, then we can also go on. This one is written. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
We'll start within a few minutes.
Sure, sure.
Yes.
Are you in college?
I'm in college, sir. Yeah. Just in case, we need some technical assistance, so it's better to be in college.
I know.
Should I this thing? Join YouTube. Hmm? You're on YouTube.
Yes.
So I'm on YouTube. YouTube will join. It's not necessary. Chapter 3.
Join करेंगे बाद में इसको नहीं join करेंगे.
Join the video.
How many registrations, ma'am, so far?
350, sir.
Oh, good.
350, yeah.
How many registrations, ma'am, so far?
350. Just volume permitted.
A warm welcome to all of you. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the AR Burla Mahila Mahavidyalaya, the Department of English and IQSC, I take this opportunity to welcome you all for this one-day national webinar on In Search of the Holy Grail, Research in English Literary Studies. We are very happy to see the overwhelming response from the participants all over the nation. And a special mention to all the scholars from MN for their actively participating for this webinar. It's an honor to welcome today's resource person, Dr. Prantik Banerjee, sir. And I'm sure we are going to be captivated by by sir's intellectual discourse. Now, I request Professor Dr. Annie John, ma'am, convener of this webinar, to throw more light on this webinar and introduce our resource person. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhagyashree. It gives me great joy to welcome you all for this webinar. The topic of our webinar is In Search of the Holy Grail, Research in English Literary Studies. The pandemic has been devastating. The entire world has taken a leap into the unknown. Epidemics have always afflicted humans, but they have also taught us important lessons. While we realize how fear can keep us apart, how terrible isolation can be, how miserably the sick die, and how easily we can infect others. It has also taught us to remain positive and make the best of the situation that we are in. The pandemic has forced us to think critically, be creative, communicate, collaborate, and be agile. It is also revealing that there is another way. People are looking for solutions that in the past they did not want to see. Actually, real change takes place in deep crisis. As teachers, how can we lag behind? It is necessary to keep ourselves upgraded and live up to the many challenges thrown at us. Keeping this in view, our college, A.R. Burla Mahila Mahavidyalaya, Solapur, the Department of English, and IQAC have come up with the national webinar of interest to all. To repeat the topic, it's In Search of the Holy Grail, Research in English Literary Studies. Our resource person today is Dr. Prantik Banerjee. I would like to introduce our resource person. Dr. Banerjee is Associate Professor, Department of English, and former IQAC Coordinator, Hislop College, Nagpur. He is an academician, research supervisor, curriculum designer, creative writer, and corporate trainer. Sir is member of Board of Studies in English, RTM Nagpur University. He is also member of the Syllabus Designing Committee, and he is PhD examiner of Bharatiya University, Tamil Nadu. Sir has to his credit 25 years of UG, PG, and research level teaching. His doctoral degree was on a study of the negotiation and contestation of place, culture, and identity in the fiction of Amitav Ghosh. Dr. Banerjee is research supervisor and has published a number of books, anthologies, and research papers. To mention a few of his titles, his books are A Postscript on Missing Keys, A Reader in Cultural Studies. And a few of his anthologies include Global Perspective on Cosmopolitanism, Border Nomadism and Politics, New Approaches to Post-Colonialism, Caste, Gender and Race, A Politics of Hegemony, Globalization, Australian Asian Perspectives, Asian Literature in English, Identity and Survival, Traversing from Local to Global, Journeys Across Time and Space, Literature and Films, Adaptation and Beyond, Readings in Protest Literature, and Literature of War and Conflict. His areas of research include cultural studies, film theory, medical humanities, post-colonial studies, trauma studies, gerontology, disability studies, and he is also interested in higher education policies, quality assurance framework, and curriculum designing. He has delivered talks at a number of national and international conferences. He has also delivered the annual endowment lectures at Loyola College, Chennai, and Jyoti Nivas College, Bangalore. Dr. Banerjee is a creative writer. He is a published poet and short story writer. His poems have featured in Sahitya Akademi's Indian Literature, Pen, Brown Critic, Kavya Bharat, Journal of Poetry Society India, etc. He has been featured as the Poet of the Fortnight in Femina by Kamla Das. Such articles have also featured in Indian Express, Nagpur edition. Some of his other milestones include being an expert on the drafting committee of NCCI's higher education policy. He has served as NAC expert and RUSA trainer. He has conducted a number of training programs for colleges and universities. He is also external advisor to IQAC of many reputed colleges and universities and is actively involved in the Kokardkar committee report. He is also an expert on various selection committees in various colleges. Dr. Banerjee is also a certified HRD trainer from TCS Bengaluru, and he has conducted several teacher and corporate training programs. So today we have a multi-dimensional personality, and I'm sure we are all going to be benefited by his intellectual discourse. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Banerjee.
Thank you so much, Professor Annie John, convener of this webinar. And first of all, I'm extremely grateful to the college principal and the management, as well as the IQAC team, and of course, Dr. Annie John, for having given me this opportunity to share with me a few things that I am passionate about, and specifically a research in the area, in the generic area of English literary studies. A hearty welcome to all the participants, and I'm delighted to know that there are quite a few people who have joined us for this webinar from Yemen as well. So I'm not sure about the time zone that they are. So wherever they are, well, a hearty good afternoon to all of you. And hopefully, as I take you through my talk in the next 90 minutes or so, what I would like to do today is, as Professor Annie John has mentioned, the topic of my talk today is In Search of the Holy Grail, Research in English Literary Studies. Normally, maybe before March of this year, if there were an ordinary or rather a face-to-face conference or a physical conference or seminar, this would be the time when participants perhaps would have been after having a lunch, a sumptuous lunch sometimes. This would really have been that time of the day when attention spans are difficult and even more challenging, therefore, for for a speaker to hold the attention of participants as they perhaps finish their lunch and come back, um, uh, perhaps dragging their feet into the auditorium for the post-lunch session. So normally, had it been a physical conference or a physical seminar, this would have been the state of things. But as Professor Annie was saying, uh, the times have changed. They not only have changed, the time is also out of joint because of the pandemic. And most of us, in fact, would have already completed a day's work either in college or off college. I'm sure most of us would have taken our online classes. And therefore, to come together in a post-lunch session, as one would call, is perhaps to come to be really keen and interested. I assume that one would join if only if one were keenly interested and not really having a thought for 40 wings. So having said that, friends, as I said, I would like you to base my talk on research in English literary studies. And, when we talk about research, um, I think I would like to start from a very, very fundamental and basic question of what is research. And I think there is a lot of ambiguity and vagueness if we start looking at the definition of what really is research. So, without attempting uh, a formal definitive definition, what I would be perhaps what I would like to say as opening remarks on research is to take that fundamental and basic question of what is research or what is a research paper. And I think sometimes, as Einstein said, that the most simple things in life are the most complicated. And therefore, when you pose a question which everyone assumes has an answer taken for granted, I think that itself needs a reinterrogation, perhaps an exploration again of the word research or what is a research paper. So let me start with a fundamental give an answer. A non-research paper is both simple and complex. A non-research paper is about a text, the writer of the text, and a reader of a text. A research paper, on the other hand, is about that and something larger. As the American philosopher and literary critic Kenneth Burke described the research paper as an engagement in a conversation that may stretch back hundreds of years and include any number of other scholarly voices. So, as a researcher, you can contribute to that conversation by making yourself an informed participant in it. As a researcher, you become not just a careful reader of the text in question, but a historian of the text's life. As a researcher, you know when the text was born, for example, who its friends and enemies were, what the text accomplished for better or worse, and how the text has been remembered by those who came after it. Now, in knowing those things and contributing to the conversations about the text, you as a researcher fundamentally keep the text alive. And perhaps not just the text, you don't just keep the text alive, but you keep the conversation about the text going, which is probably more important. Because friends, this conversation about a particular text, a research text, is never really just about the text. It's also about what we read, how we read, why we read, and what we value. Let me admit right off the bat that I love researching and there can be no research. There can be no research without, as Churchill in a different context said, without blood, sweat, and tears. Well, maybe not blood, but certainly there can be no research without sweat and tears. And by that I mean there can be no research without a diligent, disciplined, systematic study or systematic work. Friends, at the outset, I'd like to tell you that we do normally, as researchers or as academicians, as teachers and scholars, there is a tendency to mystify the whole of research writing and think of it like a Well, research, I wish to reiterate that research is not a search for the Holy Grail. What Isaac Asimov, the famous science fiction writer, and of course, as most of us know, that he was basically a man of science, biochemistry, I think, and but one who wrote, the famous iRobo series. Uh, Isaac Asimov, I remember, once said that the most exciting words in research is not eureka, but that's kind of funny. By that, of course, he was trying to say that that many of the top scientific discoveries have been the outcome of chance, of accident, of sheer luck, or serendipity. Well, it is true that that Madame Curie discovered radium by mistake. Alexander Fleming found penicillin by chance, or even a Bengali made rosogullas by accident. But friends, these are only exceptions. Research is not just a matter, is not simply a matter of luck, chance, accident, or serendipity. Most of the time, doing research in any field, doing research in literary studies, in fact, is to follow the same processes as one would do in the natural sciences. And that is forming a hypothesis, collecting data, which in literary studies would mean, collecting our primary or secondary sources, testing our hypothesis or testing that particular data against the hypothesis that we have formulated at the start of our research, and then, of course, reaching a conclusion and drawing some inferences. The bottom line is that research has to be original. I mean, research is not reinventing the wheel. It should be original. And when I say original, it means that it should be able to contribute to the body of knowledge that already exists in a particular field or in a particular area. You know, so let me repeat what I said earlier, and that is that research is not a search for the Holy Grail. We do need to strip research of its mystical garb, or this garb of almost an esoteric exercise or an esoteric process. We do need to think of research as the product of hard labor, industry, diligence, rather than of genius. I mean, of course, I mean, there will always be exceptions, I do admit, but most of the time, research is about, like I said, sweat, well, not blood, but certainly a lot of sweat and sometimes a lot of tears as well. So, in a sense, when I say that research is not a search for the Holy Grail, I've just deconstructed the very title of my talk. The title of my talk was, or is, In Search of the Holy Grail. And I believe that research is not a search for the Holy Grail. Um, oops, like an absent-minded professor, I forgot to uh, share my screen with you. Give me a minute. I seem to have some problem. not able to share my screen. Can the technical support team help me?
Yes, sir.
I'm not able. I have my PPT
Okay.
open open on my desktop.
Yes, sir. Just you have to do one thing. Share your screen, and then
I did. I did
okay.
share my screen.
Okay. The second option is just share your window.
Okay, just a minute.
Oh. Present now.
Yeah,
Okay.
fine, fine. Yeah, I think I got it.
Okay.
Can you see? Can you see my
Yes, sir.
screen
Yes,
now?
sir.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yes, visible.
Great. All right. You know, this is the tipping moment, as Malcolm Gladwell would have said, uh, where the big things often uh, depend upon such a small thing as a sharing of screen. And this is again the difference that has happened in the last 6 months between a physical conference or a face-to-face seminar, and when we are holding a webinar through a digital platform. Just as in a physical conference, everyone would be a little anxious at the start of the conference, whether the PA system or the mics are working properly or not. I think for every resource person, as well as for the organizers, as Gladwell said, this would be the tipping moment, not really knowing whether the digital gods would be with us or not. Anyway, so I was saying that in a sense, although the topic of my talk is In Search of the Holy Grail, I wish to deconstruct the very title by suggesting to you or by emphasizing that research is not a search for the Holy Grail. And I'll come to that a little later. So, like I said, what is research? And I was telling you that to engage in research, whether you are writing a research paper or whether you are going through the throes of doing a PhD, I think doing research is essentially, as Kenneth Berg said, is to enter into a conversation, is to enter into a dialogue, which can take you back hundreds of years and enter and engage in a discourse with people who have been researching on that particular topic before, and those that will come after you. Well, if research is something, as I said, is something that strives to add value to a particular area or a particular discipline or field, then perhaps when we talk about research being original and innovative in nature, just how original should research be? Um, well, I'm reminded of an audacious hoax, uh, of a hoax that was played out in the academia, in the field of research, almost 2 decades back. And this hoax is today has become a very famous example, call it famous or call it a notorious example of how what should not be research in the academia, or what should not qualify as research in the academia. This is called the Sokal affair. In the late 1990s, Alan Sokal, a professor of physics at the New York State University, uh, he wrote an article in which he glossed his own ideas in academic jargon. And then what he did was that Sokal sent off this jabberwocky, this nonsense article that he had written to an academic journal named Social Text. Now, this social text, the journal Social Text, was supposed to be, or is even today considered to be, one of the most reputed and one of the most reputed journals in the field of social sciences and humanities. And at one time, some of the leading contributors to this journal included people like uh, theorists and critics like Frederick Jameson and Edward Said. Well, what do you know? Sokal sent this gibberish paper that to the editors of the journal, and well, what do you know? It was published. Now, when it was published, Sokal made the whole affair, the so-called affair, public by calling for a press conference and letting the people know that he had actually tried a trick by writing a paper which was basically nonsense, which only had a lot of critical jargon in it, and the paper was published. So this, friends, as the slide shows, this is what he told the world. He said, "I decided to try a modest, though admittedly uncontrolled experiment. Would a leading North American journal of cultural studies, whose editorial collective included such luminaries as Frederick Jameson and Andrew Ross, would they publish an article liberally salted with nonsense if A, it sounded good, and B, it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions?" Well, friends, I give you this instance of Alan Sokal playing this hoax on this reputed journal named Social Text. Uh, well, when the whole thing flew off the handle, it seemed as if Alan Sokal wanted to prove the most damning charges that critics of postmodernism had long leveled against it. Remember, this whole event took place, this whole incident or episode took place in the 1990s, just when postmodernism was coming into its own. And so many critics, particularly liberal humanist theorists, the traditional theorists, often alleged that the postmodern discourse was itself quite a meaningless discourse. And because not even experts, uh, these critics of postmodernism claim, not even experts could distinguish between people who made sincere claims in the name of research in postmodernism and those who composed deliberate gibberish, such as Alan Sokal. Well, in the months after Sokal went public, social text was much ridiculed. But then, as I said, oh God, we have a power failure here. Excuse me, am I audible?
Yes, sir. You're on.
Mm. Well, the weather gods. I was talking about the digital gods, and I completely forgot about the weather gods. There's a thunderstorm here, and there's been a load shedding. So so suddenly I find myself in pitch dark. Give me a minute.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure.
So God said, "Let there be light," and I hope there is light again. Hmm. I think I said it too soon, saying that the digital gods. I wish the digital gods would be with us. Uh, anyway, so well, we started. So this is the notorious Sokal affair, and which just goes on to show. The reason I'm citing this example is to suggest that in the field of literary studies, much of what is passed on as research, whether it is a thesis or whether it is research papers, seem to be dogged with two basic flaws. And that is, one is redundancy, and the one is redundancy, and the other is ambiguity. And by the by, I will be talking about perhaps these two common fallacies of which beset the production of quality research papers in India. Um, Friends, this is something that I always I'm very passionate, and I'm very keen to share with my own research scholars or any young research scholar wanting starting out to do his or her PhD or writing his or her paper. The gentleman on the slide before you is Umberto Eco, and of course, you know, uh, this almost in 1977, almost 3 years before Umberto Eco, as we all know, the famous postmodernist novelist as well as semiotician, uh, before 3 years before Umberto Eco became uh, uh, known worldwide because of the groundbreaking novel The Name of the Rose. 3 years before the publishing of this classic cult postmodernist novel, The Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco published a rather innocuous sounding book called How to Write a Thesis. And remember, Umberto Eco himself was a professor in the University of Turin. And so this illustrious postmodernist writer and semiotician published a rather unpretentious and sometimes funny guide for his favorite audience, and that is his own fellow teachers, his own fellow colleagues, as well as the students of the University of Turin. Now, friends, I would strongly recommend, although this might seem to all of us a little dated by the fact that it was published way back in 1977, uh, I would, to everyone interested in research or passionate about research, I would strongly recommend this book. The book has incidentally been translated into 17 languages, but it finally, and this is again a quirk of fate, or call it, uh, a quirk of history, it finally appeared in English in 2015. Now, this particular book by Umberto Eco, How to Write a Thesis, delivers not just practical advice for writing a thesis or for writing a research paper, practical advice like, from choosing the right, to researchers on how to choose the right topic, how to take notes, and how to master the final draft. But the book I strongly recommend also because it has so much of meaningful lessons that can equip scholars, teachers, and researchers almost for a lifetime outside the walls of our campuses or outside the walls of our classrooms. And I love to quote this. One of the lines that I regularly go to in whenever I reread this book, and I reread this book often, is Umberto Eco saying that your thesis is like your first love. It will be difficult. It will be difficult to forget. After all, in the end, our thesis, or even our first research paper, it represents our first serious and rigorous academic work, and that is no small thing. So I love the fact that Umberto Eco talks about doing research or your first research publication as your first love. And as all of us, perhaps, who have experienced, that if doing research is like our first love, then of course it is not only about romancing our thesis or romancing our research hypothesis, but it is also about having a lot of heartbreaks. And that is what I meant when I said that research is, calls for a lot of tears and sweat. Anyway, uh, it is in this book that you will find Umberto Eco giving us some surefire chestnuts, like telling the researcher, especially a young researcher, that you are not Proust, that you are not Marcel Proust. Do not write, do not write long sentences. And that is what I meant, that that among the two major flaws that I have encountered in my long experience as both a researcher as well as an examiner is the tendency of many young researchers, or rather, why young? Many researchers to believe that that research, the quality of a research is reflected or indicated by the obtuseness of its language or by the length of its sentences. Well, I'm clearly trying to emphasize once again that research, let us not turn research into a mystical phenomenon. Poet Wallace Stevens' poem named 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And the poem is a rather lengthy poem divided into 13 sections, but one of these sections, section 2, is what you see on the screen. It starts by saying, Stephen starts the poem by saying, among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. And then the second stanza, or the second section, it says, I was of three minds, I was of three minds, like a tree in which there are three blackbirds. So the poem consists of 13 short separate sections, excuse me, each of which mentions a blackbird in a highly original way. Although Stevens was inspired in writing this poem by following the Japanese haiku. None of the sections in his poem follows strictly the conventions of haiku. But in each section, Stevens presents an ordinary blackbird, contrasting it with the things present in nature. And he seems to develop in the poem the idea that even the smallest of objects have their place in the natural world. Now, I find the poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, and what Wallace Stevens does in the poem, to be a good analogy to the dilemma of the researcher and what research is all about. First, the dilemma of the researcher is like the speaker in Stevens's poem, saying that I was of three minds, like a tree in which there are three blackbirds. Often, I have found a young researcher or coming to me, uh, you know, uh, uh, and many a times right after completing uh, the masters, uh, this young researcher would be bursting with excitement over theory, and then she would come to me, or he would come to me, talking about how he's faced with a dilemma, with a problem. And the problem again would be in terms of three minds or three responses. So the first response typically would be for the young researcher to be telling me, sir, I feel close to feminism, or post-colonialism is after my heart. So which writers should I take up to apply the theory? Uh, the second response of a young researcher would be, I'm super excited about Margaret Atwood after watching Handmaid's Tale on Netflix. So can I take her up for research? Uh, mind you, when I was a young researcher, at that point in time, doing research, for example, on P.G. Wodehouse was unthinkable. So let's not blame this researcher. I'm giving you just random response scholars coming to me. And then the typically third mind, the research scholars who, in a third response reveals that, well, I'm reading Amitav Ghosh. Which theory can I apply to his work? Friends, whenever as a researcher you are caught up in this kind of a dilemma, having these three or more than or any other question or response in your mind, let me let me tell you that research is not a prop. Research is not a peg on which you can hang your theory. There is an organic relationship between text and theory, and no matter that we often fall into young researchers often fall into the trap of getting bowled over by a particular theory and then decide to apply the theory uh, lock, stock, and barrel to the interpretation of a text What I do wish to suggest is that there is an intrinsic and organic relationship between the several theoretical lenses that we can wear and the texts that we examine, or the authors or the writers that we wish to examine. Doing research, in fact, is looking at a black bird in 13 different ways. And just as one may look at a black bird in 13 different ways, a researcher may look at a text in 13 different ways. Of course, 13 is just a number, and there are unlimited ways in actual research practice to approach a text, especially a multi-layered, a rich multi-layered text. The crucial point I'm making with the analogy to Wallace Stevens's poem is that research involves a two-step process. First, a researcher may not search for the Holy Grail, but she must seek and find her own black bird. In other words, you must seek a topic or an area which you dig, an area which you are interested, and not even your supervisor. And second, having found your blackbird, the researcher must now try and look at it in the 14th way, not in the 13 ways, but in the 14th way, or else by combining any two or more of the already existing 13 ways. Only then will your research will be of immense satisfaction to you, because it will be original, it will be innovative. I'm going to quickly take you, friends, through 5 ways of looking at blackbirds. And by that I mean, I'll consider 5 ways I'll place before you 5 new areas of research. All of them are interdisciplinary. They demand a multidisciplinary or an interdisciplinary approach, and all 5 areas open up exciting possibilities of engaging with a range of issues English literary studies. The 5 areas, or the 5 blackbirds that I choose to look along with you, are conflict literature, petrofiction, pandemic literature or pandemic popular culture, gerontology studies, and disability studies. Well, the first way of looking at a blackbird, and I'm looking at this blackbird, is what I conflict literature. So traditionally, we English teachers deal with conflict as one of the central tropes of literature in our classrooms. So while doing different texts, while teaching different kinds of texts, from Shakespeare and Wordsworth to Eliot and Green, we commonly categorize conflict as man versus man versus nature, um, man versus society, man versus self. And when we do these texts from the point of view of these 5 broad categories of conflict, rush to Professor Google and Dr. Wikipedia to make their notes. But conflict literature has a resonance, it has a meaning quite different to our earlier traditional understanding of conflict. An important strand of the literature of conflict today is the literature of looking at the images on the screen. Sadly, what we are witnessing as conflict in the 21st century has taken a form and a scale that has been unprecedented in human history. Baudrillard, the postmodern philosopher and thinker, said he identified or he defined Can the technical team tell me audible?
Hello, sir.
My,
So your voice is
yeah,
not clear. Maybe,
my voice is not clear.
yes, sir.
Is it is it clear now?
No, sir. Hello?
Just a minute then. Let me put on my head.
Yes, yes, sir.
Let me put on my headphone. Just a minute.
Yes, yes, sure, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Hello?
Hello,
Sir?
can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Hello?
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. You are very much audible.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, sir. Hello?
I can hear you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. You are
Yes,
very
sir.
much.
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Am I audible?
Hello? Hello, sir. Banerjee, sir?
So, no.
Hello?
Oh, good. Okay, okay.
Okay.
All right. Yeah,
Thank you.
Hello, sir? Banerjee, sir?
He
No,
can't
he,
hear.
he unmute his.
He is for the time.
Hello, sir? Please unmute your mic.
Sir, please unmute your mic. We can't hear you. 1 minute. Unmute, kill him.
Hello, sir? No, sir, your screen is not presenting. Huh? Your mic is on mute. Okay. I think hold, sir. Oh, yes, yes. Okay, sir. Sir, may I ask you something? If you join your phone, it's better. We will share your PPT later. If you orally can explain, it's better. It's better for you? Yeah, sir. Yeah, yeah. That's why I'm asking you. Yeah. It's better to join with your to your mobile. Okay. 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 Yes, sir. Yes.
Where you will join? Sorry.
Just give me a minute.
Yes, sir. Sure.
In the meanwhile, you can make an announcement.
Wait, where is the body?
Microphone they'll think from my
Hey,
side.
nine, from their side.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Am I am I
Yes,
audible?
yes, sir. You are very much audible, sir.
Okay.
Please
All right. So
start your
shall I
presentation, sir.
just a sec. Should I share my screen now, or should I just give the talk?
If it's convenient for you, so or you can just give your talk. We'll share the PPT later.
Fine, fine.
Yeah.
That's okay. All right. So, like, man, this reminds me of you know uh, a spaceship launch of where the famous U.S. space shuttle, where they said that Houston, we have a problem. Uh, Neither the digital gods nor the weather gods have been kind enough today. Today, right now, even as we are joined on this uh, platform, on this, there's been a thunderstorm in my area, in my city, Nagpur, and so so many glitches and hassles. So um, I beg the participants' indulgence. So let me continue by saying that the first blackbird that I was talking about, we are looking at, is conflict literature in general, and with particular reference to 9/11 literature. And by 9/11 literature, I mean it refers to a body of work, a corpus of work that has emerged in response to the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. So, like I was saying, that it is said that the world changed after 9/11. It is also said that literature changed after 9/11. And Ground Zero and the unfolding loss and trauma found an intense imaginative response from writers from having diverse affiliations, Anglo-American writers, Asian and South Asian writers, and they have reacted to what has been called what other people have talked about 9/11 as the defining moment of the century so far. And these writers, in their narratives, have made 9/11 either the central event of the story or as the backdrop. Uh, uh, you will be surprised to know that till date, over 140 novels have been written on 9/11, or specifically on the terrorist act, besides an enormous body of poetry and nonfiction. Friends, I believe that this is an area which should invite a lot of critical attention, particularly research engagement, because it immediately opens up the intersection between history and literature, the intersection between historical events and their literary expressions, which we all know, as we all know, is a very symbiotic one. As cultural representations, we know that literary texts are historically produced and they are historically contingent. And literatures of conflict, specifically literature on terrorism, for example, facilitates our understanding and interpretation of traumatic events such as acts of terrifying, terrible acts of terrorism by placing them in a historical context. So when I say that the relationship between history and literature is a symbiotic one, well, we have any number of area studies within literary studies, like war literature, trauma literature, partition literature, Holocaust literature. All of these are some of the areas of conflict studies that are now being studied, that have been studied in university departments for many decades. But in recent times, conflict literature with specific reference to 9/11 or the literature of terrorism has also emerged as one such specialized field of research and study. Uh, One of the interesting things that, when traumatic historical events like Holocaust or partition of not or 9/11 have always challenged writers to produce new kinds of writings, literary genres, styles, and techniques. And in fact, writers have often struggled to give imaginative expression to events of extreme violence, such as terrorist acts. Traumatic events have seen, that's primarily because traumatic events have seemed so unimaginable and incomprehensible as to render them in literary texts or in literary narratives. It was Theodor Adorno who said that to write poetry after Auschwitz was barbaric. But nevertheless, writers have refused to canonize silence, and they have written. And often in their writings, they have challenged and resisted the official truth or the official narrative. And in doing so, writers, in their response to traumatic events, in their response to a crisis of terror, in their response to a terrorist act, have produced what we call the literature of protest and the literature of dissent. So, what I wish to tell you is that 9/11 literature or terrorism, the literature of terrorism, is therefore a black bird that demands a critical look. And uh, you know, what can, for example, be of interest to researchers in 9/11 or terrorism is how was 9/11, for example, represented? What kind of writings did it produce? What was the space for such literature in the official rhetoric or the media narrative? How did it react with the discourse on global terrorism and the war on terror? What new forms, genres, styles of writing emerged out of the collision of political, social, and ideological forces, etc., etc. So the point, friends, here is that 9/11 literature actually invites a careful examination of text, whether it is fiction writing or non-fiction. And so far as research is concerned, researchers can compare and analyze the novels from the standpoint of thematic concerns, the use of distinctive modes of characterization, or the use of certain unique stylistic features and techniques. Uh, One interesting line of investigation, again from the point of view of research on 9/11 literature, could be to find out if the location and culture of the writer determine the way in which he or she represents 9/11 in fiction. So, for example, what I'm suggesting is that for a young researcher, one could perhaps look at a couple of texts written by Anglo-American writers and texts written by Asian writers or South Asian writers, having the common thematic preoccupation with 9/11, and then look at the question of ideology or the politics of race or the politics of identity or the politics of ideology that underpins the writing of these novels. So, and also perhaps this area of uh, terrorism literature or 9/11 literature, one throws up certain questions which would be interesting from the research point of view. For example, how is terror and fundamentalism, Islam and jihad, religious and racial profiling and stigmatizing? How do issues of resistance, justice, and equality, how are these all represented imaginatively in literary texts? A second blackbird that could open up a new vista or a new avenue so far as research is concerned is what I call petrofiction. I mean, if I said that petroleum and its products have saturated, fueled, and driven our lives, it would seem to be stating an obvious truth. I mean, didn't the recent news of another hike in petrol and diesel prices spoil our morning cup of tea? Uh, to think about oil is not just to think about automobiles and derricks or spectacular spills or barrel prices. I mean, even the computer, the phone on which you and I are connected in today's webinar is made out of material which basically comes from oil. So it's no exaggeration to say that the modern culture that makes our living reality is a hydrocarbon culture. It is hardly surprising that international and domestic politics too are completely attuned to the goings on of the oil industry. So, uh, I mean, compared to what we call the great themes of literature, which have often been the favorite go to subjects so far as research is concerned: war, partition, uh, famine. um, uh, Petroleum seems to have played a rather muted role in the field of literary studies. But in recent decades, it has drawn a lot of attention because it has become an important trope in literature and has inaugurated an exciting multidisciplinary field of study. I mean, if you really look at how far back in time oil has been represented in fiction or in literature, well, it actually goes back to 1927, and it was Upton Sinclair, the American writer, who came up with a novel in 1927 called Oil. But it was almost 65 years later, in 1992, that Amitav Ghosh, he, in an essay called Petrofiction, the oil encounter and the novel, coined the word petrofiction. It was in this essay, Petrofiction, titled Petrofiction, the oil encounter and the novel, that Ghosh was actually reviewing the works of a Middle Eastern writer named Abdul Rahman Munif, specifically his trilogy called Cities of Salt. And I so wish, I could have shared the screen with you had it not been for both this power failure as well as the network issue. Anyway, in that particular essay, Amitav Ghosh was arguing that when compared to the overwhelming dependency of the global economy on oil, it is surprising, he said, that oil and its related issues remain underrepresented in world fiction. Ghosh goes on to point out in the essay that this relative silence, especially from the Western powers, is something that is almost akin to a pornography of silence. He states, and I quote from that essay, he states that the history of oil is a matter of embarrassment, verging on the unspeakable and the pornographic. And according to him, a lot has been invested by Western powers to ensure the muteness of the oil. Towards the end of the essay, he poses a question. And the question is that in spite of the seepage, in spite of how our culture is suffused and driven by oil for so many centuries, how is it that novelists and writers have not taken oil or its impact upon our social, cultural, and economic lives as a suitable theme for literature? And this is probably the same thing, probably in a more amplified manner, Amitav Ghosh was dealing in his next book called The Great Derangement, where he talks about how climate change, like oil, for example, like oil encounter or oil culture, has been underrepresented in literature. Well, friends, I believe that there are now any number of oil fiction or petrofiction, as Amitav Ghosh was the first to term it, which are available and which could possibly excite the attention and interest of a lot of research. Because in recent years, there have been a lot of writings which have dealt with the intersection of petrol, global capitalism, and its politics and effect on nation states, the identity and the cultural identities of people, etc. And some prominent examples of oil literature, if you were to Google petrofiction or oil literature, you would come across a host of writers as well as their works, and many of them very contemporary, writers as diverse as the Canadian George Mackay Brown's Greenwood to somebody from Nigeria named Helen Habila, writing a book called Water on Oil. What is it? Why should petrofiction draw the attention of research scholars? Well, as I said, petrofiction is the fictional representation of the many political and cultural dimensions of oil, but it becomes an entry into the analysis or a critique of petrofiction would enable the researcher to recuperate, for example, oil histories, how the histories of oil have at all times been has underpinned the history of colonialism or neo-colonialism, and how the petroleum industry, with the dominance of multinational companies, have continued to operate, have continued to dominate, have continued to exercise power and exploit in third world countries, for example. So doing or critiquing petrofiction is to look at narratives by placing them within the context of, say, even displacement and migration of labor. And we all know how till recent times, from the 1980s till recent times, there has been a huge migration, exodus of labor, of Asian labor. Why even from India, for example, from down south, from Kerala and Cochin. So also petrofiction, those of you who are into eco-criticism, for example, petrofiction is a very exciting avenue, which makes us look at oil novels or oil fiction from an eco-critical framework to register, for example, the relationship that oil has had to hasten and accelerate our ecological crisis. Uh, One can even look at narrative modes employed in petrofiction, which is mostly post-apocalyptic and dystopian kind of storytelling. So, friends, what I'm suggesting is that as a researcher, you can inquire into the many ways in which this new body of relatively new writings called petrofiction address the infiltration of oil and its impact on the defining features of our modern life. A third blackbird that I would suggest today is plague literature, or what is called plague literature, outbreak literature, or simply pandemic studies. Uh, Professor Annie John at the beginning was remarked on how terrible a crisis we all are going through. And truly, the ongoing COVID pandemic has made the time out of joint. It has caused a paradigm shift in the way we think, not only the way in which we think and battle it out with the disease, but the way we think of literature and culture and life itself. And so, given the crisis of the times that we are experiencing, plague literature or pandemic literature could possibly be, a very relevant and topical area of research. Uh, Writers, cultural theorists, and literary critics are already talking about pre-COVID literature and a post-COVID, pre-COVID literature and a post-COVID literature, drawing a timeline between before and after COVID-19. Uh, so, you know, outbreak literature or plague literature, it's a new terrain, as I said, and one can even enter into the larger area of cultural studies in order to investigate and inquire how diseases, epidemics, for example, have been represented in films and popular fiction. And which means I'm talking about popular culture rather than classic literature. So when I'm talking of classic literature dealing with diseases or outbreak narratives, well, there are again a host of writings right from the 16th and 17th century onwards, like Boccaccio's Decameron, Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, to modernist classics, modernist fiction like Albert Camus' Plague or Mary Shelley's The Last Man. But what perhaps is equally fascinating is to look into the area of popular culture, particularly how best-selling novels and Hollywood blockbusters, for example, have represented disease or have represented plagues and other epidemics. Um, so in terms of research questions, one can, as I said, one can look at pandemic literature or pandemic studies. One can take up research on the multiple intersections of infectious outbreaks, uh, mm, uh, you know, uh, because I believe that pandemic narratives, which are outbreak sites, not only are breeding grounds of deadly pathogens, but they can also be examined as contact zones of racial, cultural, and biomedical politics. So, uh, well, uh, so from a researcher's point of view, uh, a few questions that can break new grounds in research is: what is the relationship between pandemic and geopolitics? What new forms of political belonging will be engendered by global epidemics? Will, for example, Benedict Anderson's nation of imagined community change into a nation of imagined immunity? And questions like, will the pandemic create new epidemiologies of belongings? So these are some of the many research problems that can attract the attention of research scholars. And as I said, it is interdisciplinary. The approach would be interdisciplinary. So somebody from humanities and as well as social sciences can take this up. The fourth, um, the fourth blackbird that I'm looking at, that I would like you to see with me, is gerontology studies. When I say gerontology studies, I mean of aging. It is now widely accepted that age and aging are a cultural phenomena. When you are so when you're looking at gerontology, for example, if we look at Hemingway, we are we are immediately reminded of his code, for example. Besides Nada, we talk about the Hemingway code, and the Hemingway code, for example, epitomized in so many of his novels and short stories, is that what made Santiago the old man and the sea, from his Pulitzer Prize winning novel, The Old Man and the Sea, famous that a man can be defeated but not destroyed. So when you talk about, a recent research scholar who is working on this area of masculinity studies, and masculinity studies in Hemingway's novels from the point of view of Hemingway's aging heroes. So literary gerontology, or gerontology literature, is an examination of the representation of age and aging, of debilitating disease, of loneliness, of old age homes, of community care centers, of the emotional and spiritual needs of old people as characters, and of course of looking at the themes of abuse and abandonment of old people as represented in literature. So uh, you know uh, the stories about aging have now become an invaluable cultural resource in order to understand better the experience of growing old. And uh, one important book that I would like to cite here is Mike Hepworth's Stories of Aging, which is considered to be a groundbreaking book in the field of literary gerontology studies, because Mike Hepworth was the first author, is the first critique to explore literary fiction from the point of view of aging from the point of view of gerontology or aging. Uh, it is in this book that Hepworth gives us a detailed analysis he selects some contemporary novels, modern fiction by people like John Updike, Paul Auster, Jonathan Franzen, Anne Tyler, Jane Smiley. And if you are really interested in this particular field, again, interdisciplinary, because mind you, this is very interesting that literary texts about age and aging are now prescribed even in the field of medicine. Uh, in order to, it's like an attempt to bring humanities to medical students or nursing students in order to evoke the humanity in them. So it's a very groundbreaking area, and therefore I would encourage many participants who are listening here, who are tuned into this webinar, to look at gerontology studies, literary gerontology studies, as a very, very engaging and productive way of looking at the intersections between old age, disease, illness, with its literary representations. And there are any number of texts that are available. A portrait of an artist, not as a young man, a portrait of an artist as an old man by Joseph Heller. Joseph Heller, whom we probably remember by his more popular and more famous novel Catch 22, the anti-war novel Catch 22. Then there is and of course Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee, which is prescribed in most master's degree program in most universities. Uh, you could even go back, like I said, one of my research scholars is planning to go back to Ernest Hemingway and look at his oeuvre, look at his body of writings from the point of view of masculinity studies and aging. Even Latin American literature, for example, you think of the novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, two novels that come to my mind immediately, The Autumn of the Patriarch and Memories of My Melancholy Horse. These novels would probably invite a very, very refreshing and different outlook, different approach, if one were to use some of the critical concepts of gerontology studies in re-examining, in recovering and re-examining these texts from a very, very non-traditional, non-conformist point of view. For that matter, when one is teaching Shakespeare, for instance, where even in my undergraduate class, doing King Lear is to take a look at Lear, for example, the figure of Lear or the figure of Gloucester, for example, as aging men, and looking at their psychological trauma of trying to cope up with failing powers, both mental as well as physical. So in a similar fashion, a lot of research work is going on from the angle of gerontology to Victorian literature, and Dickens novels again come to my mind. Great Expectations, Miss Havisham, the enigmatic and fascinating figure of Miss Havisham would be a figure that would draw attention in Great Expectations from the point of view of gerontology studies. So I'm trying to suggest that these and many other ways could be possible entry points of a young researcher to look at gerontology studies, to look at both canonical texts such as Victorian literary texts or even modernist novels from the point of view of gerontology or critical gerontology. A fifth and the final blackbird, friends, that I'm proposing here is one of disability studies. And once again, one is reminded of Lear because it is. Ask yourself: do we think of King Lear as a disability text? Hardly, rarely. Because looking at King Lear as a disability text is again going back to a canonical text and examining it in a very, very innovative and in a very different and innovative manner. Scene, for example, Act 1, Scene 1, where Ken tells, after King Lear has made this disastrous mind-boggling decision of dividing his kingdom among and leaving Cordelia without even an acre of land. It is Kent, remember, who tells King Lear, that you got to see, and because you're wrong in your judgment because you cannot see. He says, hold on to your crown and use your better judgment, Lear. And the whole text, if one goes back rereading the text, one finds a very, very common trope, a very significant metaphor in terms of Lear going blind. Blindness becomes one of the most prominent tropes in King Lear. And this invites an approach from the disability studies point of view. Blindness not just as a physical impairment, but as an inability to make the correct choices, to make wise decisions. Well, literature has been a rich source to study and understand disabled minds, such as, Sylvia Nasr's A Beautiful Mind, the novel Sylvia Nasr's A Beautiful Mind, which was based on which was based on John Nash's, the famous Princeton scientist, John Nash, and his battle with schizophrenia. or for that matter, Christy Brown's My Left Foot, which again is a modern novel dealing with Vietnam, and a war victim. So disability is everywhere in literature across all periods and genres, whether in medieval saints narrative, the sentimentality of the the sentimentality of the 19th century novel, the modernist obsession with eugenics, or contemporary preoccupations with mental health. And therefore, uh, you know, uh, as a researcher, one probably could look at texts like King Lear or John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, or Thomas Beckett's a play like Thomas Beckett's Endgame from the disability point of view, because disability studies examine literary texts in the manner in which these narratives construct able-bodied characters. uh, how they kind of privilege. There is a privileging of the body as normal uh, in canonical texts. So defining, for example, one you know those who take disability approach to literature try to look at the manner in which texts have tried to define what normal is, because defining what is normal is not a benign act. It is not a benign act. It is not a harmless act, because the act of defining what is normal creates and employs power. So normal and normative is a social construction, as Michel Foucault would argue. And therefore, the able body as normal is constructed, as Foucault has told us, has shown to us that the able body as normal is constructed in a number of ways, biologically, medically, institutionally, politically, and socially. And ableism itself, therefore, is a form of prejudice against people with disabilities. Uh, and it is, and because ableism is a form of social and cultural prejudice, it is on par in its violence and in its cruelty. It is on par with sexism, racism, etc., etc. So, why research in disability studies? Well, like I said, to do research in disability studies is to is to inquire into the inseparability of the body politics, the politics of the body politics, and the body polity. What I call the politics of the body politics, and the body polity. Because as Foucault has shown, how technologies of how technologies of normalization are used by societies to control and define uh, those who are non-normative, those who are non-normal. So the heterosexual becomes not normal, the crippled becomes non-normal, the madman or the insane person becomes not normal, and therefore the criminal also becomes a deviant. And so disability studies therefore makes us explore disability in literary texts in terms of, for example, character, metaphor, theme in literary narratives. And more importantly, when as a humanities researcher, when one takes the disability studies as a framework, as a critical framework or a critical lens to approach literature, it is basically to sensitize people to the pressing issues about aging, to evoke empathy and compassion, the need for care of our old people, uh, social care, and citizenship. So, what are the disability texts? Doing, uh, you know, Doing curtsy, for example, as one does in a master's program, is to look even at disgrace as a disability studies. Or another book, Curtsy Slow Man, Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. One can go to William Faulkner, for example, The Sound and the Fury, or for that matter, in a post-colonial studies, it's interesting to look at the it's interesting to look at Jane Eyre and the figure of Bertha Mason, not just as a mad woman in the attic, as Susan Gilbert and Sandra Guber have interpreted it from a feminist point of view, but to look at the way in which disability, which includes the onset of madness or the onset of insanity, can privilege, or rather, can marginalize a character, a colored character, in a more heightened way. So, whether we go to poetry, whether we are reading John Milton's On His Blindness, or Wilfred Owen's Disabled, uh, or whether we are reading autobiographies or biographies, autobiographies like Helen Keller's The Story of My Life, or Christy Brown's My Left Foot, or, as I said, if we go to fiction like Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, well, disability studies gives us again an exciting possibility to engage with things that perhaps go beyond, not just about research, but also being a humanities student, being a humanities researcher, uh, to sensitize ourselves uh, to disabled people and their needs and their desires and their rights. So, friends, these are the 5 blackbirds. Unfortunately, I couldn't share screen with you. It got blackened out. But, when we talk about research in literary studies, there is a prevailing opinion that research in English studies in India is going through a quiet crisis. I feel it's not a quiet crisis. In fact, the crisis is no longer quiet. It has become so loud, it has become so raucous that it can no longer be glossed over. And this crisis in research in English literary studies, I believe, has been brought on by the production of poor quality research, which primarily is because of 3 major causes. Well, I don't have the time to go through them, but what I call the 3 major causes, I call them: one is pedagogic malingering, basically laziness. The second is what I call Google search, or Google research rather, Google research, Control C plus Control V research. And the third, the mind and art of mindlessness. I've had the experience of being a referee as well as an examiner in many defense of research candidates. And without generalizing, I'm not generalizing, but sometimes I do feel very unhappy and disappointed. And so after a researcher makes or presents her research, it's like I often find myself turning to another referee and then saying, does this lead us to an overwhelming question? And so my friend would say, oh, do not ask what is it. Let the candidate have his PhD and even deal it. Friends, I'll end from where I started out, that research is not a search for the Holy Grail. Yes, research is perhaps taking the road not taken. And in my talk today, I've tried to map some new terrains in English literary studies. These are areas, the 5 blackbirds that I suggested are areas that are not only new, emerging domains, but also ones that invite interdisciplinary approaches. Of course, I mean, the 5 blackbirds that I have highlighted in today's talk are just possibilities. These are just, suggestive in nature, because research in English literary studies offers almost an inexhaustible store of exciting subjects and themes. I'm hopeful that the 5 ways of looking at a blackbird, or the new area studies in my talk, will help make your research truly an adventure of the mind, an odyssey of the spirit. Thank you so much. And once again, my apologies that the digital gods, as well as the internet connectivity, failed us today. But, well, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, we are very enlightened with your knowledge and presence. Now, I request respected Dr. Wagmare, sir, to propose a vote of thanks. Over to you, sir Wagmare.
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Panchappa Wagmare. I'm here to express my gratitude to the dignitaries who graced this webinar. First of all, I extend my thanks to Honorable Dr. Pratik Banerjee, sir, for his deeper insight on the research in the realm of literature in a current scenario. He even concentrated on the common fallacies of young researchers. Research which is not a matter of luck, or it is not a matter of chance or accident. It's not a search for holy grail. Rather, it is a meticulous investigation of the facts and ideas by using empirically verified hypotheses. Thank you very much, sir, for giving various dimensions of doing research in disability studies, gerontology, even petrofiction, and even conflict literature. I would further extend my gratitude to Honorable Principal of our college, Dr. Rajendra Senge sir, for his incessant support and even motivation. I would especially thanks to our head of the department, Dr. Anijan ma'am, for organizing such a wonderful event. And my deeper regard and gratitude to the participants for supporting us and making this event more successful. And finally, with the permission of our head of the department, I declare that this program is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Banerjee sir, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And once again, very unfortunate that we couldn't do it in the manner in which we had imagined.
Just a humble request, sir, if you could share your PPT, then we can just share it to the participants who are interested, because it was a wonderful PPT
Sure,
actually.
sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure,
sir.
sure. Yeah.
PPT, then we
Yeah.
can just
Thanks. Thanks
share
again.
it to the participants who are interested, because it was a wonderful PPT actually.